The first shovel struck the frozen ground 3 days after the Mercer brothers sold the farm, and by sundown, both men understood they had given away far more than land. For nearly 80 years, the Mercer place had stood on the western edge of Bellwood County like an old man too stubborn to die. The red barn leaned slightly to the left. The white farmhouse had gone gray where the paint had peeled. The fence line disappeared under wild blackberry and rusted wire. In summer, the fields shimmered gold and green. In winter, they looked stripped bare, as if the land itself had grown tired of being asked to survive. To Daniel Mercer, the farm had always smelled like sweat, diesel fuel, and disappointment. To his younger brother, Caleb, it smelled like memory. That was the difference between them, and perhaps the reason they had spent most of the last 10 years speaking only when funerals, hospital calls, or signed documents forced them into the same room. Their father, Walter Mercer, had been dead for 12 days when Daniel parked his truck beside the porch and stepped out into a hard January wind. He wore a dark coat, city shoes unsuited to mud, and the expression of a man who had already counted the cost of grief and found it less urgent than overdue bills. Caleb arrived 15 minutes later in a dented blue sedan with one headlight out and a week's worth of exhaustion under his eyes. He had driven through the night from Knoxville after finishing a shift at the restaurant where he had gone from sous chef to line cook to whoever's willing to close the kitchen because nobody else showed up. They saw each other across the yard. Neither smiled. Daniel was the older one by 7 years, broader in the shoulders, with their father's square jaw and their mother's gray eyes. Life had weathered him fast. At 42, he already looked like a man who had spent too many years carrying burdens he never admitted were heavy. He owned a small freight business in Chattanooga that had nearly collapsed twice in the last 3 years. His ex-wife no longer trusted him with promises, and his teenage daughter Ava loved him cautiously, as children love fathers who mean well but often arrive late. Caleb, 35, had inherited the softer part of the family face. He had once been handsome in an easy, thoughtless way, but grief and long nights had sharpened him. His hands were burn-marked from kitchen work. His hair needed cutting. He still moved like someone who expected old arguments to leap out from corners. The porch steps creaked under Daniel's weight. "You're late," he said. Caleb looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Good to see you too." Daniel's mouth tightened. "We've got a meeting at 11. With the lawyer? With the buyer?" Caleb stopped halfway up the steps. "Today." Daniel nodded. "That's why I told you to get here yesterday. I got here as fast as I could. That's never really been your strength." Caleb laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "And kindness was never yours." The front door opened before Daniel could answer. Hannah Bell stood in the doorway with a wool shawl drawn tight around her shoulders and a dish towel folded in both hands. She was 58, though the last few years had placed extra winter in her face. Her late husband had worked the neighboring orchard before cancer took him. Since Walter's stroke the previous spring, Hannah had been the one who drove him to appointments, brought over casseroles he pretended not to need, and made sure he took the pills he pretended not to forget. In Bellwood, people said Hannah Bell kept more broken things alive than the local clinic. "You boys can fight after coffee," she said quietly. "Not on the porch." Daniel exhaled sharply through his nose and stepped inside. Caleb followed. The house was colder than a home should have been. Though the stove in the kitchen gave off heat, the rooms carried the stale chill of old grief and recent death. Walter Mercer had not been an easy man in life. In death, he had left behind the same stubborn impression he had in every room he'd ever occupied. That tenderness was a luxury and silence was a form of discipline. The dining table was covered in stacks of papers. Tax notices, medical invoices, seed catalogs from years when Walter still believed next season might rescue the last one. A chipped mug sat near the edge beside his reading glasses. Caleb looked at the glasses and had to look away. Hannah poured coffee into 3 thick ceramic cups and pushed one toward each brother. "Mr. Jameson will be here by 10:30, she said, "and Mr. Pike by 11. Caleb looked up. "Pike." Daniel took a sip. "Raymond Pike. He wants the farm." Caleb set his cup down without drinking. "You already found a buyer?" Daniel gave him a flat look. I didn't find a buyer. Pike's been circling this place for years. Then why didn't you wait until I got here to talk about it? Because there's nothing to talk about. Caleb turned to Hannah, as though she might translate the sentence into something less brutal. Dad was buried less than 2 weeks ago. Hannah's eyes moved to Daniel. I said the same. Daniel leaned both palms against the table. The bank doesn't care how long ago he died. The county doesn't care. The electric company doesn't care. There's a lien on the western parcel, medical debt from the rehabilitation center, and taxes so far behind the numbers look like somebody made them up for sport. We can either sell now or watch the place get taken apart piece by piece. Caleb's jaw worked. You don't know that. I do know that, Daniel snapped. Because unlike you, I've spent the last year answering calls from people Dad ignored. The room fell still. Hannah looked down at her hands. Caleb stood slowly. You think I didn't care? Daniel laughed, low and tired. You visited twice in 3 years. And you, Caleb shot back. You came here to lecture him, to fight with him, and to leave before supper. Don't act like you were the faithful son because you knew how to sign paperwork. Daniel took 1 step forward. Hannah said, sharply now, enough. Both men stopped. She rarely raised her voice. When she did, people listened. Your father is gone, she said. Whatever punishment you wanted to keep handing him, you're both too late. So if you mean to destroy each other, at least have the decency not to do it in his kitchen. No one spoke. The clock above the stove ticked. Wind pressed against the windows. Finally, Caleb sat again. Daniel rubbed a hand across his face and looked older than he had when he arrived. Hannah reached into the pocket of her apron and laid something small on the table between them. It was a brass key tied to a faded strip of blue ribbon. Walter's ribbon. Their mother, Rose, had tied blue ribbons to everything she wanted the boys to notice when they were little: school bags, lunch pails, branches in the orchard where she had handwritten clues for Sunday treasure hunts. Caleb stared at the key. What's that? He asked. Hannah hesitated. Your father gave it to me in November, she said. He told me if anything happened before spring, I was to make sure you boys stayed until the thaw. Daniel's head lifted. For what? She met his eyes carefully. He said there was something buried beneath the old sycamore. Caleb looked toward the back window automatically. Even from the kitchen, part of the sycamore was visible beyond the pasture gate. A giant white-bark tree near the hill where their mother used to spread quilts in June and read aloud while lightning bugs rose from the grass at dusk. Daniel's expression changed from curiosity to irritation so fast it was almost insulting. Buried? He said. What is this, a riddle? Hannah held the key more tightly. He made me promise I'd tell you exactly as he said it. He said, when my boys are both standing on this land together again, tell them not to sell a single acre before they dig under your mother's tree. Caleb went very still. Daniel leaned back. And he waited until he was dying to mention this? I asked him what was buried there, Hannah said. He told me I'd know when the time was right. Daniel gave a short, humorless laugh. That sounds like Dad. Caleb reached toward the key, but Daniel's hand landed on it first. We don't have time for this, Daniel said. Hannah looked at him with open disbelief. Walter never spoke like that unless it mattered. Walter also believed fertilizer companies were spying on him through extension agents. That was 1 time, Hannah said. It was 6 times. Caleb spoke without looking up. Maybe we should dig. Daniel turned to him as if he had suggested setting fire to the barn. With what? The excavator Pike's sending after we sign? Caleb, listen to yourself. We're grown men with debt notices piled to the ceiling. And you want to delay a sale because Dad left a key and one of his farmer prophecies. Caleb's eyes flashed. Maybe because sometimes his farmer prophecies were just him trying to say something without sounding weak. Daniel said nothing. Hannah looked between them and saw what old wounds were waking in both men. Daniel had spent his life translating emotion into logistics. Caleb had spent his translating pain into escape. Wait 1 week, she said softly. That's all I'm asking. The ground will soften if this cold breaks. Dig then. If it's nothing, sell afterward. Daniel shook his head immediately. Pike won't wait. Caleb stared at him. Since when do you care what Raymond Pike wants? Daniel's voice lowered. Since he's the only buyer offering enough to cover everything. That landed heavily. Hannah folded her hands. Caleb stood and walked to the window, staring out at the sycamore. It stood alone near the rise beyond the pasture fence, its pale limbs reaching into the winter sky like old fingers. Their mother had planted bulbs around its roots. Their father had carved their initials in the bark one summer when Caleb was 7 and Daniel was 14, though later he denied doing anything sentimental. Under that tree, Rose Mercer had once patched Daniel's skinned knee with the hem of her dress. Under that tree, Caleb had hidden the first letter he wrote after leaving home at 17 because he was too ashamed to hand it to his father directly. Under that tree, Walter had knelt the day Rose was buried and remained there until nightfall. And now Daniel wanted to sell the land without even lifting a shovel. At 10:30, attorney Marvin Jameson arrived in a tan overcoat, carrying a leather briefcase and the air of a man who had spent 30 years explaining that reality was rarely fair but always binding. He greeted both brothers, accepted coffee, and spread the sale documents across the table. By 11, Raymond Pike walked in. He did not belong in the Mercer kitchen. Everything about him seemed designed to remind rural people that he had risen above whatever places once embarrassed him. His boots were too polished. His cashmere coat was the kind bought in cities where no one touched dirt except as a landscaping concept. He was 51, broad around the middle, and handsome in the sleek, predatory way that made old women call him charming and wise men lock their doors when he smiled too easily. He had built 6 luxury countryside developments across the state, converted family land into gated communities with names like Fox Run Preserve and Hollow Ridge Estates, where city people paid obscene amounts of money to pretend they had returned to nature. "Gentlemen," he said warmly, removing his gloves, "I'm sorry about your father. Walter was a hard man, but a respectable one." Daniel gave a curt nod. Caleb did not bother to hide his dislike. "You knew him?" Pike smiled. "In a county this small, everyone knows everyone." That was not an answer, and they all knew it. He laid a folder on the table. "I'll be direct. My offer remains exactly as discussed. Full purchase of the house, the outbuildings, and all 142 acres. Immediate transfer of possession. Funds released within 48 hours. Marvin Jameson cleared his throat. "My clients are aware." "My clients," Caleb repeated. "Interesting." Daniel ignored him. Pike continued smoothly. "I know this is not an easy time, but I believe speed in this case is a mercy. The market is favorable now, and interest rates. We know how selling works," Caleb said. Pike smiled again, just enough to show that being challenged by men with less money always amused him. "Of course." Hannah, still standing near the stove, said quietly, "You could give them a week." Pike turned toward her as though noticing a chair had spoken. "I'm sorry. A week," she repeated. Walter left instructions about the old sycamore. The boys should check beneath it before signing anything. Marvin Jameson adjusted his glasses. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Pike's expression barely changed, but something sharp and hidden passed through it like a fish beneath still water. "The old tree by the rise?" he asked. Caleb noticed. "Why do you care which tree?" Pike gave a soft chuckle. "I don't. I'm simply trying to understand the concern." Daniel stood. "There is no concern. We're here to sign." Caleb turned on him. "You don't even want to know why Dad said it?" "I want this finished. Because you need the money." Daniel took a step closer. "Yes, I need the money. I need it for the business. I need it because the bank is 2 missed contracts away from taking my trucks. I need it because my daughter's braces don't get paid for with nostalgia." Caleb's face changed. "So that's it. That's reality. And what if there really is something out there?" Daniel gestured around the room. "There is something out there. Frozen ground, dead grass, and a tree." Caleb looked at Hannah. She said nothing, but her silence was its own plea. Pike set a pen atop the paper. "Gentlemen, I don't mean to press, but I have crews scheduled. Delays affect everyone. Caleb stared at the pen, then at the window, then at Daniel. I'm not signing today. The room snapped tight. Daniel's voice went flat. You don't get to do that. I just did. This place belongs to both of us. Exactly. Pike folded his hands. Perhaps I should give you a moment alone. No, Daniel said immediately. Sit down. He looked at Caleb with the expression of a man standing on the edge of something he could not afford. What do you want? Daniel asked. 1 week. Impossible. 5 days. Still impossible. 3, Caleb said. 3 days. If there's nothing under that tree, I'll sign whatever you put in front of me. Pike's jaw shifted. Very slightly, but enough. Daniel saw it. So did Hannah. And for the first time that morning, suspicion entered the room like a physical draft. Pike recovered quickly. 3 days is inconvenient. But if that is what settles your conscience. No, Daniel said quietly. Everyone turned to him. Pike's smile thinned. Excuse me? Daniel's eyes were fixed on him now in a way Caleb recognized from childhood. The way Daniel looked at men before fistfights and at engines before he took them apart to find what was wrong. You came here expecting us to sign without thinking, Daniel said. You knew Hannah would mention the tree, and you were hoping I'd dismiss it. Pike gave a small laugh. This is absurd. Is it? Daniel stepped closer to the table. You asked which tree. You pretended not to care. But you cared enough to identify it. Pike's gaze cooled. There are many trees on this property. Not one called your mother's tree. Silence. Caleb slowly sat back down. Hannah's hand went to her throat. Marvin Jameson looked from one face to another like a man wishing he billed by emotional damage. Pike straightened. If you intend to accuse me of something, do it clearly. All right, Daniel said. You want this land too badly. That might have sounded foolish on another man, but Daniel was not foolish. He was the sort of man who spent years ignoring intuition until suddenly it grabbed him by the collar. Pike buttoned his coat. I'm offering a fair price for distressed property. Then you can wait 3 days. Pike's eyes hardened. If I walk out now, the offer changes. Then let it. Caleb blinked. He had not expected that. Neither had Hannah. Pike looked at Daniel for a long second, measuring whether the older brother had finally become inconvenient. Then he smiled again, though the charm was gone from it. Very well. 3 days. Noon, Friday. He pulled the pen back, tucked it into his pocket, and lifted his folder. But I would advise you not to confuse grief with good judgment. When he left, the kitchen stayed silent until the sound of his SUV disappeared down the gravel road. Then Daniel sat heavily at the table. Caleb stared at him. What changed? Daniel rubbed his jaw. I don't know. Hannah's answer came before Caleb could speak again. Yes, you do, she said softly. You saw what I saw. Daniel did not look up. Maybe. Caleb frowned. What? Hannah moved to the window and looked toward the sycamore. A man doesn't hide impatience that carefully unless he's afraid of what time might uncover. It rained on Thursday and turned the top layer of frozen ground to black, stubborn mud. By dawn Friday, Daniel and Caleb stood beneath the sycamore with 2 shovels, a pickaxe, and the sort of silence brothers share when the years between them are too crowded to cross easily. The tree rose above them like a ghost of summer. Its trunk was broad enough that 3 men together might not have circled it fully. The bark was white and silver, peeling in great paper-thin strips. Their mother used to call it her moon tree because it glowed at dusk. Hannah brought out coffee in a thermos and an old wool blanket to throw over the mound of dirt. You boys remember where your father used to set the picnic table? She asked. Caleb nodded. South side. Then dig north of the roots, she said. Walter once told me the earth there stayed softer because Rose liked daffodils. Daniel drove the first shovel in with more force than necessary. Caleb took the second spot. They dug in shifts, not speaking much at first. Cold air smoked from their mouths. Mud clung to their boots. Birds startled from the hedgerow whenever metal struck stone. The labor stripped away pretense faster than conversation ever could. After 40 minutes, Caleb stopped to catch his breath. "You really would have signed," he said, leaning on the shovel handle. Daniel kept digging. "Probably. Even after what Hannah said. I told you. I needed the sale." Caleb studied him. "How bad is it?" Daniel jabbed the shovel into the soil and answered without looking up. "Bad enough." Caleb waited. Finally, Daniel straightened and wiped sweat from his brow despite the cold. "One of my drivers wrecked a rig in October. Insurance covered part of it. Not enough. Then a contract with Dalton Foods fell through. Then the transmission went on the backup truck." He gave a dry laugh. "You know how life works. It waits until you're limping to start kicking. Why didn't you tell me?" Daniel looked at him as if the question itself was absurd. "And what would you've done?" Caleb's mouth opened, then closed. Exactly, Daniel thought, but he didn't say it. Instead, he drove the shovel deeper. "What about you?" Caleb gave a low snort. "What about me? You look like hell." "That's touching." "I'm serious." Caleb stared at the hole for a while. "Restaurant closed in August." "I didn't know you had one." "Had half of one. Investor pulled out. Rent doubled. Chef quit. Then my partner discovered spiritual freedom in Colorado and took most of the liquor inventory with him." Daniel stopped. "You never said. You never asked." That was unfair, and both men knew it. But the worst part was that it was also partly true. Hannah, watching from the blanket with gloved hands around her coffee cup, said nothing. Some wounds need air before they can be stitched. The brothers kept digging. By noon, the hole was 4 feet deep and wide enough to suggest either madness or faith. Caleb had begun to suspect they had inherited the first in place of the second. Daniel's shoulders ached. Mud streaked both their coats. The sycamore's roots spread thick as old bones, twisting through the earth in pale, muscular arcs. At 12:22, Caleb's shovel struck metal. The sound rang through the cold air so sharply that all three of them froze. Then Caleb looked up. Daniel looked down. Hannah stood. No one spoke for 3 full seconds. Then Daniel dropped to his knees in the mud and began clearing soil away with both hands. Caleb joined him. Beneath a mat of roots sat a rust-darkened iron box about the size of a bread loaf, fitted with a thick brass lock corroded green at the edges. Hannah climbed to the edge of the hole, breath visible in the air. "Dear Lord." Caleb let out a laugh that sounded closer to fear. He actually did it. Daniel's hands were shaking. He brushed dirt from the lid and saw something scratched into the metal, nearly worn away by time and damp. DM/CM. Their initials. Caleb swallowed hard. Hannah held out the brass key with the blue ribbon. "It's yours," she said. Daniel took it, though his fingers had gone strangely numb. He slid the key into the lock. It resisted at first, then turned with a grinding click that sounded much louder than it should have. Together, the brothers lifted the lid. Inside lay 3 oilcloth bundles, a mason jar full of old coins, a sealed envelope addressed to my sons, and a smaller cedar box tied with another piece of faded blue ribbon. For a long time, none of them touched anything. The world seemed to contract around the open chest. Wind moved through the upper branches with a sound like whispered pages. Caleb looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at the envelope. Finally, he picked it up. The paper had yellowed but remained dry. Walter's handwriting cut across the front in blunt block letters, as though sentiment had to be disciplined into straight lines before he could trust it. Daniel opened it carefully. Inside was a letter written in their father's hand. He read the first line silently, then had to stop. Caleb took a half step forward. "What?" Daniel swallowed. Then he read aloud. "If you are reading this, then one of 2 things has happened. Either you listened for once or you sold too quickly and came back too late. I pray it was the first. But I know my sons." Caleb laughed once despite himself, tears already standing in his eyes. Daniel kept reading. "Beneath this tree I have buried the truth I failed to say in life because pride is a sickness passed from father to son unless somebody finally breaks it. First, the jar of coins belonged to your mother's father. He buried them during the bank panic of 1987 and gave them to Rose when she married me. We kept them for the day one of our boys would need rescuing and be too ashamed to ask. Second, the cedar box belongs to both of you. Open it together, not before. Third, and most important, do not trust Raymond Pike. He came to me twice in the last year acting like a friend and asking questions about the spring and the Northfield. He knows what is under this land. If he is trying to buy it cheap after I'm gone, it is because he believes you boys are hurting enough to mistake desperation for wisdom. Daniel stopped reading. Caleb's face had lost all color. The spring. Hannah sat down suddenly on the edge of the hole as if her knees could no longer be negotiated with. There's more, Daniel said, though his own voice had thickened. He continued, your mother found the old survey in 1999, the one folded in oilcloth below this letter. The county geologist marked a deep limestone aquifer under the western acreage and a clean natural spring running through the ridge. That water is worth more than the whole farm ever looked like it was. I kept the papers because I didn't want companies turning this place into pipelines and trucks. Maybe that was foolish. Maybe it was the only decent thing I ever did. If you need to sell, sell honestly and for full value. But if Pike is the one asking, know this, he already tried to get a state permit through one of his shell companies. Rose found the application before she got sick. There are copies of everything in the cedar box. There is also something else your mother wanted you to have when you were men enough to read it. I was not good at saying love, so I farmed it. I fixed your engines, put food on the table, fought the weather, and expected you to understand the language without hearing the word. That was my failure, not yours. If you're standing under this tree together, there's still a chance to do one thing right. Do not let need make fools of you, and do not let this land go to a man who smiles too easily. Dad. No one moved. The winter field seemed impossibly quiet. Caleb took the paper from Daniel with both hands and stared at their father's signature until the letters blurred. He knew, Caleb whispered. Daniel looked into the box again. The mason jar was packed tight with gold coins and old half-eagles, some darkened with age, some still faintly gleaming beneath the dust. Beneath the letter sat two thick folded documents wrapped in oilcloth. Hannah crossed herself without thinking. Open the cedar box, she said softly. Daniel lifted it out. The blue ribbon had been knotted by hands more careful than Walter's. Rose's hands, both brothers thought at once. Caleb untied it. Inside were three things: a stack of letters bound with twine, a flash drive, and a small velvet pouch containing a silver locket they had not seen since the day their mother was buried. Caleb made a broken sound. Daniel closed his eyes. Hannah pressed the dish towel to her mouth. The top letter was in Rose Mercer's handwriting. For Daniel and Caleb, if your father ever finds the courage to give this to you. Caleb sat down right there in the mud. Daniel lowered himself beside him. He unfolded the first page. Rose's words were softer than Walter's, but no less direct. My boys, if you are reading this, then something has finally made your father brave. I hope it wasn't death, but I know the man I married. He can fix a combine in the dark, but would rather swallow nails than cry in front of his sons. There are things I wanted you both to know. The farm is not poor land. It only looks tired because we have been tired. Beneath the ridge is water clean enough to supply half this county. Walter wanted to protect it. I agreed. But I also knew one day the burden of that choice might land in your hands. If that day comes, choose people over pride. Choose each other over old hurt. And remember that land is never just dirt. It keeps every kindness and every cruelty done upon it. Daniel could not read further for a moment. Caleb stared at the locket. He remembered their mother wearing it while hanging wash, while kneading bread, while singing under her breath when she thought no one was listening. After she died, Walter locked her things away so completely it felt, to both boys, like he had buried her twice. Daniel took the next page. Inside the bundle were separate letters, one to Daniel, one to Caleb, one written jointly, and several sealed documents. The oilcloth maps turned out to be exactly what Walter had described. Geological surveys, handwritten notes, permit inquiries from a company named Ridgewell Water Partners, and one typed letter dated 14 months earlier offering to discuss private acquisition of subsurface water rights in the Mercer West Tract. The amount mentioned in the proposal made Daniel's stomach drop. $3,800,000. Caleb snatched the paper and read it twice. That can't be real. Hannah leaned closer. It is. Daniel turned the page over. Why would Dad never answer this? Because he didn't trust them, Hannah said. Because he was Walter Mercer. Because after Rose got sick, he stopped believing anything that came with glossy paper and a promise. Daniel stared across the field toward the western ridge. Beneath that quiet, ragged land lay enough value to save his business, pay every debt, repair the house, and still leave something meaningful for once. And he had nearly sold it to Raymond Pike for less than a quarter of what it was worth. Caleb lifted the flash drive. What's this? Hannah shook her head. I don't know. Daniel rose suddenly. We're taking everything inside. By 2:30 that afternoon, the documents lay spread across the kitchen table where sale papers had sat days before. Outside, the sycamore stood unchanged, as if hiding fortunes and family truth beneath its roots were no more dramatic than holding birds in summer. Marvin Jameson returned at Daniel's insistence. So did Sheriff Lyle Granger, a square-faced man with old-fashioned caution and a healthy distrust of anything involving Raymond Pike. Jameson read the survey reports twice, then removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Well, he said, this changes everything. Sheriff Granger studied the permit letter. Ridgewell Water Partners is one of Pike's shell outfits. Been whispered about for years. Hard to prove. Easier now. Caleb looked up sharply. You knew. Granger shrugged. In a county like this, knowing and proving are distant cousins. Daniel pointed to the old application copy. If Pike knew about the aquifer and didn't disclose that when he made the offer, Jameson nodded slowly. It may constitute fraudulent inducement, especially if he misrepresented the land's known commercial value. But we'd need more than suspicion. Caleb held up the flash drive. Then maybe this is our more. They plugged it into Daniel's laptop. The drive contained scanned copies of the same geological reports, photographs of Pike's men walking the West Ridge with survey stakes, and, most damaging of all, a recorded conversation between Walter Mercer and Raymond Pike captured on what appeared to be an old phone recording app. The audio crackled, but the voices were clear enough. Pike, you're sitting on an ocean and acting like it's a puddle. Walter, that's why I don't want you near it. Pike, your boys will sell when you're gone. Men in debt always do. No one in the kitchen moved. Then came Walter's voice again, harder than iron. If my sons ever shake your hand on this place, it'll be because I failed them first. The recording ended. Hannah sat down slowly. Caleb looked as though someone had struck him in the chest. Daniel closed the laptop with both hands and stared at the table. Their father had known about Pike, known about the water, known his sons might be desperate enough to sell out of pain and fear. And instead of telling them plainly, he had buried the truth beneath the only tree their mother ever asked him not to cut. It was infuriating. It was deeply, unforgivably Walter. It was also the only reason they still had a chance. At 11:55 Friday morning, Raymond Pike returned to the Mercer farm to complete the sale. By noon, 2 sheriff's deputies, Marvin Jameson and Daniel Mercer, were waiting for him in the kitchen. Caleb stood by the stove. Hannah remained at the far counter with both hands wrapped around a cup she had not touched. Pike entered smiling. The smile lasted 4 seconds. Then he saw the papers. Something wrong? He asked. Daniel did not invite him to sit. You tell me. Pike's gaze moved to the survey map, the permit letter, then to Sheriff Granger, who had arrived quietly through the back door. The developer's face did not collapse. Men like Raymond Pike do not break in obvious places. They leak confidence slowly, like oil from a cracked seal. I'm not sure what game this is, he said. Daniel reached for the laptop and pressed play. Walter's voice filled the room. Pike's expression changed on the first sentence. By the end of the recording, no one needed a confession. The developer's charm vanished entirely, revealing the contempt beneath it. All right, he said softly. What do you want? Caleb actually laughed. You really thought this would end with negotiation. Pike looked at Jameson. No contract has been signed. No money changed hands. There's no crime in making an offer. Not generally, Jameson said. But state permitting inquiries under undisclosed corporate entities while pressuring heirs to sell below known water rights value? That interests people. Sheriff Granger added. Especially when you've got survey teams trespassing months before the owner dies. Pike's jaw flexed. I trespassed nowhere. Daniel stepped forward. You counted on us being too broken to notice, he said. That was your mistake. For the first time, Pike dropped the civil tone. This county's full of men clinging to dirt because they inherited stories and confused them for assets, he said. You think that aquifer makes you rich? It makes you a target. Companies bigger than mine will bury you in paper. Taxes will rise. Neighbors will sue. Environmental boards will take years. I was offering you an exit. Daniel looked at him without flinching. You were offering us a theft with polished shoes. Pike smiled coldly. And now, Caleb answered this time. Now you get off our land. Pike's eyes moved from one brother to the other, then to Hannah, then back to Daniel. This isn't over. Sheriff Granger stepped closer. It is for today. Pike buttoned his coat with deliberate calm, but rage showed in the small violence of his fingers. He left without another word. When the door shut behind him, the room seemed to exhale. Caleb sat down heavily. Daniel remained standing, staring at the sycamore through the window. Hannah looked at him. What now? He turned, and for the first time since Walter's funeral, there was something on his face other than fatigue or restraint. Now, he said, we find out what Dad was trying to save. The weeks that followed were the busiest the Mercer farm had seen in 20 years. Jameson filed notices blocking any outside claims. Sheriff Granger opened an inquiry into Pike's shell companies and land trespass. A hydrologist from the state university came out with 2 graduate students and enough equipment to make the pasture look briefly like an oil site. They confirmed the old reports. Beneath the western ridge lay a protected limestone aquifer of extraordinary purity, fed by the same underground channels that supplied the spring lower down the hill. Not only was the water commercially valuable, but the site also qualified for conservation protections that drastically limited private industrial extraction. That changed the equation completely. Pike had not wanted the land just to build luxury cabins. He had wanted control. More specifically, he had wanted the rights to negotiate future extraction deals quietly before the county understood what sat beneath its feet. When word began leaking through Bellwood, people who had barely spoken to the Mercer family in years suddenly rediscovered concern. County officials called. A regional water cooperative called. A conservation nonprofit called. Even the local paper ran a front-page story with the headline, Family Farm May Hold County's Cleanest Private Aquifer. Caleb folded the newspaper and threw it onto the kitchen table. They misspelled aquifer. Hannah, peeling potatoes nearby, said, That's your main concern? It annoyed me before breakfast. Daniel stood by the sink with his phone in one hand and 3 different legal pads on the counter. Be annoyed later. Ridgewell's parent company just requested a meeting through another attorney. Pike? Caleb asked. Probably. Tell him to buy a dictionary and spell theft correctly. Daniel almost smiled. Almost. The work brought the brothers into the same orbit day after day. There was no room left for avoidance. They ate together, argued over numbers, walked boundary lines with surveyors, dug through Walter's files in the attic, opened drawers and boxes untouched since Rose died. And with every hour spent in the house, their father became both more human and harder to forgive. They found notebooks full of crop calculations and repair lists. They found receipts Walter had saved from Daniel's high school football cleats and Caleb's culinary school knife set, the one he had claimed he paid for himself. They found a drawer lined with carefully folded hospital parking stubs from Rose's treatments, each dated in Walter's square handwriting as if record-keeping could impose order on fear. In the sewing room closet, Caleb found a cardboard box labeled D+C/school. Inside were report cards, childhood drawings, and every letter Caleb had sent from Tennessee after leaving home, including the first one, the one he had hidden beneath the sycamore because he was too ashamed to hand it over. Walter must have found it later and kept it all these years. Caleb carried the box to the back porch and sat down with it on his knees. Daniel found him there an hour later. For a while he said nothing. Then, carefully, "What is it?" Caleb handed him the first letter. The paper shook in Daniel's hands as he read the teenage scrawl. "Dad, I'm sorry I left like that. I know you think cooking is foolish. Maybe it is. But it feels like the only thing I'm good at that doesn't sound like failing. I'll come back when I've done something worth telling you." Daniel finished and sat slowly on the porch step beside him. "He kept it," Caleb said. Daniel looked at the box. "He kept all of them." Caleb laughed once, bitter and broken, and still never called. No, that man could have watched the house burn down before admitting he needed a bucket. Daniel folded the letter carefully. "You're not wrong." For a while the only sound was wind in the dead grass. Then Caleb said, very quietly, "Did he ever tell you he was proud of you?" Daniel looked out across the yard. "No, me neither." A long silence. Then Daniel said, "Once, when I was 17, the transmission went out on the combine right before harvest. I stayed up half the night trying to fix it. Couldn't. Thought he'd tear me apart in the morning." He rubbed a thumb against the paper edge. "He came out before sunrise, looked at what I'd done, and said, 'At least you didn't quit at dark.'" Caleb gave a wet laugh. "That was his love language?" "I think so. Terrible language. Absolutely terrible." That time Daniel did smile. Caleb did too. Felt small and dangerous, like ice cracking on a pond in early spring. A few days later, Ava Mercer arrived from Chattanooga for the weekend. At 15, she had Daniel's eyes and her mother's refusal to be impressed by male silence. She walked through the Mercer house with the alert curiosity of someone discovering where her father had once been a boy, and by Saturday afternoon she had charmed Hannah, followed Caleb around the kitchen asking how to brown butter properly, and taken more interest in the Sycamore story than any reporter who had called. Over supper, she looked from Daniel to Caleb and said, "So basically Grandpa buried a treasure chest because emotional honesty was against his religion?" Caleb nearly choked laughing. Daniel glared at her, but the corner of his mouth betrayed him. Hannah pointed a spoon. "Respect the dead." "I do," Ava said. "I'm just saying he could have tried a family meeting." The truth of that hung in the room. After a moment, Daniel said, "You sound like your grandmother." Hannah looked up. Rose would have loved this child. Ava glanced between them. Was Grandma like Uncle Caleb? Caleb put a hand to his chest. "How am I being assigned to the dead?" "Because you talk with your whole face," Ava said. Then to Daniel, "You got all the brooding from Grandpa. Uncle Caleb got all the actual humanity." Daniel rolled his eyes. But later, when Ava went upstairs and Caleb stepped out to smoke on the porch, Daniel remained at the table staring at the empty plate in front of him. Hannah noticed. "She's good for you," she said. "She sees too much. That's usually what good children do." He looked toward the window. "I'm beginning to think I spent half my life proud of things that were really just fear in work clothes." Hannah dried her hands slowly. "That also sounds like Walter." Daniel let out a long breath. "Maybe that's why I'm angry." The legal battle with Raymond Pike lasted 46 days. It was not a courtroom spectacle with dramatic confessions and spectators gasping in galleries. Bellwood County did not operate that way. It was uglier, slower, and more realistic than that. Filings, title reviews, corporate records, permit traces, witness affidavits, and long hours spent proving that what wealthy men do elegantly can still be called greed in plain English. Jameson, who grew noticeably more energized the meaner Pike's attorneys became, uncovered enough to build a formidable case. Pike had used Ridgewell Water Partners to file exploratory interest notices on the Mercer tract 6 months before Walter's death. He had paid an assessor-connected consultant to undervalue the western acreage based on erosion limitations, while separately circulating private investment projections describing the same land as a high-yield protected water opportunity. In simpler words, he had tried to cheat dying farmers by pretending their land was tired when he knew it was priceless. Bellwood did not forgive that kind of thing. The County Conservation Board, once made aware of the aquifer's significance, moved quickly to designate the Spring Basin as environmentally sensitive. That alone limited Pike's options. A water cooperative submitted a formal proposal, not to buy the farm outright, but to negotiate a conservation easement and long-term stewardship partnership that would preserve family ownership while compensating the brothers at a value that made Daniel sit down twice. They could keep the house, keep most of the land, pay every debt, protect the spring, and still secure enough money to change not only their own lives, but perhaps the whole county's future. When Daniel read the numbers aloud, Caleb looked toward the sycamore and whispered, "Dad, you impossible old man." Hannah pretended not to cry. The final blow came from someone no one expected. Mrs. Ellen Pike, Raymond's ex-wife, submitted a sworn statement through her attorney detailing years of concealed land acquisitions, shell companies, and one dinner conversation in which Raymond allegedly bragged that farm heirs are easiest to fleece before the casseroles stop coming. Bellwood never looked at him the same again. By March, Pike withdrew all active claims and accepted a civil settlement that included financial penalties, a public retraction regarding prior valuation claims, and an agreement barring Ridgewell-affiliated entities from future development bids on the Mercer Tract. Caleb read that clause twice just for pleasure. Daniel framed the final signed settlement page and hung it in the mudroom where Walter had once kept a shotgun calendar and a nail jar. "It belongs there," he said. Caleb laughed. Dad would call that showing off. He'd be right. The conservation agreement closed in April. The same day the funds cleared, Daniel paid off the freight company debt in full. He drove straight from the bank to Chattanooga, handed the release papers to his ex-wife, and took Ava to dinner somewhere with tablecloths because for once he wanted to celebrate without calculating cost mid-meal. When Ava asked if that meant he was rich now, Daniel answered in a way that surprised even himself. "No," he said. "It means I'm not scared the same way." Back at the farm, Caleb used his portion of the money differently. He did not rush to leave. That startled everyone, perhaps most of all himself. Instead, he spent 3 weeks converting the old washroom off the kitchen into a test kitchen with open shelves, copper hooks, and a butcher block table salvaged from a restaurant supply auction. Bellwood had no bakery worth the name and no cafe that stayed open after 2 except the gas station counter by the highway. Caleb began with pies, biscuits, and loaves of rosemary bread he sold on Saturdays from the porch. People came because of the newspaper story. They kept coming because the bread was good enough to make silence in a room. Hannah declared his peach hand pies an act of public mercy. By June, there was a hand-painted sign by the road. Rose Table, Farm Kitchen/Saturdays. Daniel made fun of the name until he caught 3 people from Chattanooga lined up before sunrise and stopped pretending the idea might fail. But the greatest change was not financial. It was the house. Windows were repaired. Roof shingles replaced. The porch repainted the same white Rose used to insist on, even though Walter called it show-off paint. Daffodils returned around the sycamore roots. Ava helped choose curtains for the dining room and bullied both men into admitting the place needed color. Mateo, Hannah's nephew who worked in carpentry, rebuilt the old orchard bench where Rose used to sit. In the evenings, after the work and the meetings and the endless practical decisions, the 3 adults often ended up beneath the sycamore with coffee or tea, the air alive with crickets and the smell of cut grass. One such evening, Caleb brought out the last unopened letter from Rose, the one written jointly to both sons, the one neither brother had yet been able to read all the way through. "I think tonight," he said. Daniel nodded. Hannah sat beside them but did not intrude. Caleb unfolded the paper. Rose's handwriting moved across the page like she was still in the room deciding how gently truth should be said. "My dear boys, if this letter reaches you, then time has done what mothers cannot always do by force. It has made you old enough to understand your father. Not excuse him, perhaps, but understand him. Walter was never cruel with his hands, only with what he held back. Men like him are made from fathers who survived war, hunger, and shame by becoming useful instead of tender. They love deeply and badly at the same time. Do not become that if you can help it. Daniel, the world will call you dependable and you will mistake that for being allowed to feel nothing. Don't. Caleb, The world will praise your fire, and you will be tempted to run each time love asks for patience. Don't. And if one day this farm sits in your hands and feels too heavy, remember this. Land is only worth keeping if it teaches you how to keep each other too. Under the sycamore your father and I once promised that whatever became of this place, our boys would never inherit only money or only sorrow. We hoped for wisdom, though heaven knows we were unqualified to guarantee it. If you have found this together, then maybe grace has done what parenting could not. I loved you before I knew your names. I loved you when you were easy. I loved you when you were furious. I loved you when each of you thought leaving would hurt less than staying. Nothing either of you does will make that sentence untrue. Please try to come home to each other before life makes the choice for you. Mom. By the time Caleb reached the last line, his voice had broken twice. Daniel took the letter from him and stared at it without speaking. Then, to Hannah's quiet astonishment, the older brother lowered his head into both hands and wept. Not politely, not briefly. Years of held-back grief moved through him with the force of weather finally breaking. For Rose. For Walter. For a childhood disciplined into usefulness. For debts, failure, lost time, and the shame of nearly selling the one place that still knew their names when they forgot them themselves. Caleb put a hand on his brother's shoulder. Daniel did not shrug it off. After a long while, he said hoarsely, I hated him for making me feel like love had to be earned. Caleb nodded, eyes bright. I know. I became him anyway. No, Hannah said softly. You almost did. That's not the same. Daniel looked up at her. The evening light had turned the sycamore bark pale silver. Wind moved through the leaves with a sound like breathing. Caleb leaned back against the bench and let out a long breath. You know what's sick? He said. Hannah raised an eyebrow. Choose carefully. Caleb gave a weak half-smile. This is the happiest I've been in years. And it's because Dad buried paperwork like a raccoon with trust issues. Daniel laughed through tears. Hannah laughed too. For the first time since Walter's funeral, the sound of family did not feel like something broken trying to disguise itself. Felt real. Summer came full and bright to Bellwood County. The restored spring line drew visitors from the Conservation Board, school children on field trips, and a professor from the state university who said the Mercer Tract might become a regional model for privately stewarded groundwater protection. Daniel found that amusing because his father had once threatened to chase a hydrology student off the property with a hoe for asking too many city questions. Rose's table grew faster than Caleb could manage alone. So Ava spent part of July helping on weekends and learning to laminate pastry dough while loudly critiquing Bellwood's fashion standards. Everyone here dresses like they're either repairing a fence or avoiding feelings, she said. That, Hannah told her, is called local culture. Daniel divided his time between Chattanooga and the farm for several months before making the decision no one expected. He sold 2 of his remaining trucks, kept the business smaller and stable, and moved back into the upstairs room where he had slept as a boy. It's temporary, he insisted. Caleb looked at him over the breakfast table. So was your hairline. Daniel threw a napkin at him. The truth was simpler. For the first time in decades, neither brother wanted to be far from the land. Not because of the money beneath it, because of what had been unearthed inside them while trying not to lose it. In late August, the county held a public dedication at the spring overlook. A modest wooden sign was installed there, carved by Mateo and paid for jointly by the brothers. It read, Rose Mercer Spring, protected in honor of those who taught us that what is hidden may still be worth saving. Sheriff Granger said a few words. The university professor said too many. Hannah said none, but stood at the edge of the crowd with tears she didn't bother hiding. Daniel was asked to speak and nearly refused. Then Ava elbowed him hard enough to make refusal impossible. He stepped to the front of the gathered crowd with a folded paper in his hand he never once looked at. I'm not good at speeches, he began, which made half the county smile because they knew it was true. My family's better at burying things and hoping time sorts them out. A ripple of laughter moved through the people. Daniel looked toward the spring, then toward the hill where the sycamore was visible beyond the pasture. My father grew up believing a man's job was to endure and provide. He did both. He also left behind enough silence to keep 2 sons angry longer than necessary. My mother spent her life trying to soften that silence without humiliating him for carrying it. He paused. What my brother and I found beneath that tree was more than documents or money. We found proof that our parents were both wiser and more frightened than we knew. The crowd grew still. Daniel drew a breath. This spring will stay protected. The land will stay in the family. And if there's any good in what happened, I hope it's this, that nobody here mistakes a hard face for an empty heart, or pride for strength, or speed for wisdom when grief is making decisions. He looked at Caleb then, and there was no practiced stoicism left in the glance. We sold nothing, he said, because someone who loved us badly still loved us enough to leave a map home. No one applauded immediately. That is how you know words have landed somewhere true. When the clapping finally came, it rolled across the hillside warm and slow. Caleb looked down at the ground and laughed under his breath. You said you weren't good at speeches. I'm still not. That one was decent. Don't get used to it. I won't. But Ava, standing nearby with a paper cup of lemonade, whispered to Hannah, "He's changing." Hannah watched Daniel shake hands with neighbors, then glance instinctively toward the farmhouse where family waited. "Yes," she said, "and not a minute too early." That autumn, after the first leaves began to yellow, the brothers dug one final time beneath the sycamore. Not because they expected more treasure, because Daniel had a small cedar box of his own, and Caleb carried an envelope tied with blue ribbon. Hannah stood nearby pretending she was only there to supervise the shovel depth. Ava knelt in the grass filming the whole thing on her phone and threatening to turn it into a documentary called Men Who Finally Discuss Their Feelings. Sort of. Daniel rolled his eyes. "Put that away. History matters," she said solemnly. Caleb laughed. When the hole was deep enough, Daniel set the cedar box inside. Caleb placed the envelope on top. Hannah looked at them. "What's in it?" Daniel answered first. "A letter to whoever comes after us." Caleb added, "And instructions not to trust any man named Raymond." Hannah gave him a look. "Be serious." He smiled, but then his voice softened. "Mom's original locket is in there too. Not to keep hidden forever. Just to mark the place." Daniel nodded. "And copies of the conservation papers, ownership records, family photos. The truth this time with labels." Ava grinned. "So the next generation won't need a treasure hunt to discover Grandpa was emotionally constipated?" Daniel pointed the shovel at her. "Language." Hannah laughed so hard she had to hold her shawl shut with one hand. They covered the box together. When the dirt was smoothed flat, Daniel stood looking at the trunk for a long moment. "Do you ever wonder," he said quietly, "what would have happened if we'd signed that day?" No one answered at first. Then Caleb said, "Every week." The honesty of it settled over them. He stepped closer to the tree and touched the bark where the old carved initials had nearly disappeared. "We would have told ourselves it was practical," he said. "We would have paid debts, gone back to our separate lives and called it survival. And every time we thought about this place, we'd feel something rotten we couldn't name." Daniel nodded once. "Yeah." Hannah looked at the 2 men, so different, so alike, and thought of Walter and Rose standing in this same spot years earlier, perhaps wondering what would become of the boys they loved imperfectly. "Then thank God," she said softly, "for old trees and late lessons." A wind moved through the branches above them, shaking loose a scatter of yellow leaves that drifted down around their feet. Ava broke the silence first, as she usually did. "So," she said, pocketing her phone, "who's making pie?" Caleb raised a hand immediately. "I am. And if anyone touches the peaches on the counter before I get inside, I'll disown the whole family." Daniel started toward the house. "You can't disown what you fought too hard to get back." Caleb followed. Hannah lingered one moment longer beneath the sycamore. The land stretched around her in afternoon gold, the barn repaired, the house breathing again, the ridge preserved, the brothers walking side by side toward the porch where light already glowed through the kitchen windows. For years she had watched this family survive by withholding what mattered most. Now, at last, they were learning a better inheritance. Not hidden money, not water rights, not even land, but the hard, humbling grace of coming back before it was too late. And if anyone in Bellwood later told the story, they told it like this. Two brothers nearly sold their father's farm because grief made them hurry and need made them blind. They thought the land was tired, the house was empty, and the old sycamore was only a tree. But buried beneath its roots were gold coins, legal papers, love letters, and the truth their parents had failed to speak aloud. They found enough money to save the farm, enough evidence to stop a thief, enough memory to break open years of anger, and enough love, late, awkward, imperfect love, to make brothers out of two wounded men again. Because sometimes the greatest treasure hidden beneath old ground is not what can be spent. It is what can still be restored. And sometimes the worst mistake a family makes is not losing the land. It is forgetting that the land remembers them better than they remember each other.